Every empire that ever rose, built on knowledge. Every civilization that ever endured, built on the ability to store it. We spend billions engineering the most advanced data systems in human history. Satellites orbiting the planet, server farms the size of cities, quantum processors crunching numbers faster than the human mind can follow. And we call it the information age, as if information is something we just discovered. But here is what nobody told you. 40,000 years before the first computer, 40,000 years before the first alphabet, before empires, before cities, before anything we recognize as civilization. Someone already solved this problem. They didn't use silicon. They didn't use electricity. They used bone and stone and an intelligence so deep, so structured, so deliberate that modern scientists, armed with AI and statistical models, are only now beginning to understand what was actually encoded inside it. This is not ancient history. This is the origin story of human intelligence itself. We tend to think of human intelligence as something recent, as if a switch flipped somewhere around 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians invented writing, civilization appeared, and suddenly we became smart. But a wave of new discoveries is completely dismantling that story. Because the evidence, from Ice Age caves, from Roman ruins, from ancient riverbeds, is pointing to something far more extraordinary. We have been recording knowledge, engineering materials, and designing complex systems for tens of thousands of years. This is the story of humanity's first hard drives. Let's start 40,000 years ago, across Ice Age Europe, in France, Germany, Spain. Archaeologists have been pulling small carved objects out of the earth for over 100 years. Bone fragments, ivory sticks, antler pieces, all of them covered in marks, dots, lines, chevrons, repeated sequences. For decades, the working assumption was straightforward. These were doodles, spiritual markings, maybe tallies of hunted animals. Then, a team of researchers decided to stop assuming and start measuring. They ran statistical analyses on hundreds of these objects. They looked at the frequency of symbols, the patterns of repetition, the structural organization of the sequences. And the results stopped them cold. The information density of these Ice Age carvings, the mathematical complexity of how symbols were organized and repeated, was statistically identical to the earliest known writing systems: Sumerian cuneiform, early Egyptian hieroglyphs, systems that came thousands of years later. Think about what that means. These weren't random scratches. They weren't decoration. They were structured, organized, intentional. The same way you organize folders on a computer, these people were organizing information on bone. One leading theory now suggests that many of these objects were lunar calendars, tracking the phases of the moon across months, maybe seasons. Hunter-gatherers keeping records of time, because time in their world meant survival. Knowing when herds migrated, when rivers flooded, when plants would return. And here is the part that should genuinely humble you. The people who made these objects had no writing tradition to inherit. No schools, no libraries, no one to teach them a formal system. They built the concept of structured data storage completely from scratch. The first hard drives weren't silicon, they were bone. Fast forward a few tens of thousands of years. Rome is at the height of its power. In the ruins of ancient Roman sites across Europe and North Africa, archaeologists have found something curious, carved into limestone floors, tavern walls, and temple courtyards. Game boards, grid patterns with worn markings around them, evidence of thousands of games played. The Romans called it Ludus Latrunculorum, the game of mercenaries. Ancient writers described it as a game of military strategy, highly complex, deeply intellectual, a favorite of Roman soldiers and philosophers alike. There was just one problem. The complete rules had never survived. Scattered references in ancient texts gave fragments, hints of how pieces moved, vague descriptions of captures, but nothing complete. For centuries, historians tried to reconstruct it and failed. Then, recently, researchers did something different. They fed everything we had, every ancient text reference, every archaeological game board, every partial description, into an artificial intelligence trained to find patterns and fill structural gaps. And the AI cracked it. It reconstructed a coherent, internally consistent rule set that matched every surviving historical clue. A game where pieces moved like Roman legions, surrounding enemies, cutting off escape routes, thinking 3 moves ahead. Your researchers then built a playable version and tested it. It worked. It was, by every account, genuinely brilliant. Strategic depth comparable to chess. Elegant, balanced. Here is what strikes me about this story. We tend to imagine ancient people as intellectually simpler, as if complexity of thought is a recent upgrade. But the Romans were designing abstract strategy games that required spatial reasoning, forward planning, and opponent modeling. The exact same cognitive toolkit used by grandmasters today. The knowledge wasn't lost because people forgot how to think. It was lost because empires fall, and sometimes the books burn with them. The intelligence was always there. Now let's go back even further, much further. 1.5 million years ago, long before Homo sapiens existed, long before language, before fire was controlled, before anything we'd recognize as civilization. In what is now northern Africa, a different human species walked the earth, Homo erectus, and they were doing something remarkable. Archaeologists excavating ancient sites have recovered bone tools crafted by these early humans, tools shaped with a precision that took researchers completely off guard. Because when scientists examined these bones under analysis, they discovered something extraordinary. Homo erectus wasn't just picking up random bones and sharpening them. They were selecting specific bones from specific animals, choosing pieces based on their mechanical properties. Dense, load-bearing bones for tools that needed to withstand pressure. Curved bones for tools that needed flex. Lightweight bones for tools requiring speed and precision. In other words, they understood material science, not as a written discipline, not as a taught curriculum, but as deep, accumulated, transmitted knowledge about how the physical world behaves. They knew that this bone would hold an edge longer than that one. They knew that this curve would distribute force differently. They were engineering 1.5 million years before the word existed. And this raises a question that should sit with you for a moment. How long did it take to accumulate that knowledge? How many generations of observation, of trial and error, of passing information from one mind to the next, before Homo erectus could look at a skeleton and know instinctively which bone to choose? That knowledge had to be stored somewhere, not on silicon, not on paper, not even on bone. It was stored in memory, in gesture, in teaching. The oldest data storage system ever invented, one human showing another human how the world works. Here is the story we were told. Humans wandered around for hundreds of thousands of years, barely surviving, mostly reacting to the world around them. Then, suddenly, mysteriously, around 5,000 years ago, civilization appeared, writing appeared, intelligence appeared. And here is the story the evidence is actually telling us. Human intelligence did not switch on 5,000 years ago. It has been accumulating, building, and compounding for as long as we have existed, and possibly longer. The timeline of human cognition is not a flat line with a sudden spike. It is a long, deep, continuous climb. The Ice Age carver encoding lunar cycles into bone, and the Roman soldier calculating moves across a limestone board, and the engineer 1.5 million years ago selecting the right femur for the right tool. They are all the same story. A species that refuses to simply experience the world. A species that insists on understanding it, on recording it, on passing it forward. That is what makes us human, not the invention of the computer, not the printing press, not even language itself. The drive to take what we know and make sure it outlasts us. Every technology we celebrate today, every database, every cloud server, every digital archive, is the latest chapter of a story that began in a frozen cave with a piece of bone and a sharpened stone. We didn't invent intelligence, we inherited it. From 40,000 years of people who looked at the world and refused to forget what they saw. If this changed the way you think about human history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the hidden depth of who we are, and I'll see you in the next one.